Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Navroz Dubash. I'm with C-PREE at the School of Public and International Affairs, and I'm sorry we're starting a little bit late. I was actually engrossed in conversation with Mike here and lost track of time. But it's unfair of me to hog his attention. We're very glad to welcome Mike Hume for the Bradford seminar today. So just briefly to introduce him, Mike is a professor of field geography at the Department of Geography at Cambridge and is also a professorial fellow at Pembroke College, where he directs the studies of geography. I've had the pleasure of going back and forth with Mike, I think, since I was teaching in India, and heard him talk about a book that has had a huge impact on me called Why We Disagree About Climate Change. And then more recently, he's written a book that has aroused a lot of attention and discussion called Why Climate Change Isn't Everything, where he talks about climatism as a sort of an anthropology. And what Mike's going to talk to us about today, drawing on his rich and long career, including his writing on the IPCC and the way in which the IPCC has helped frame the science around climate change. He's going to be taking us on a little bit of a historical tour, and the title is Framing the Climate Issue 40 Years After the Villach Conference. And I think it's going to be a fascinating and engaging conversation, and I'm delighted to welcome you here, Mike, and look forward to hearing your book.
Thank you. Good. Well, thank you very much, Navroz. Now, I hope you can hear me at the back. Is that okay? Speaking at this sort of volume. Very good. Now, let's get straight into this. So here are just a few quotes I've wrapped up in the last few days, thinking about where do people see the whole climate change thing at the moment. Obviously, Belim is going on in Brazil as we speak. This is Nature editorializing a week ago. The message from scientists is clear. Everybody needs to act, and quickly. Science first. Here's President Lula in his opening speech at Belém. Amongst other things, what he wanted was to inflict a new defeat on the deniers, the climate deniers. Here was Bill Gates in an open letter a couple of weeks back. Global temperature is not the best way to measure our progress on climate. And here from my own parliamentary committee on net zero, recent call for evidence, the global political consensus, and so on, these have all been impacted by tensions and transformations of the global order. So just in these four voices, we hear a number of different perspectives on what matters most at this current moment around climate change. And I'm interested in trying to make sense of the changing ways in which climate change has been framed, but is at this particular moment, I think, being reframed or being rethought in a number of ways. And it's always good to start with the conclusions, so you know where I'm heading. So this is, in effect, the essence of my argument, that I think the overall framing is still largely a legacy of 1980s, 1990s thinking. Numerical targets and dates, I think, provide a straitjacket which is now more unhelpful than helpful. And actually, here's the point. I think an awful lot has been achieved around this whole climate change issue, but there's more to be achieved. The glass is half full as much as it is half empty. And then as someone who is towards the end of my career, let's put it that way, I'm closer to the end than I am to the beginning, and who started studying climate change back as a geography student in the early 1990s, the early 1980s. The luxury of having been around this issue for such a long time is that anniversaries begin to pop up all over the place. So this year is the 60th anniversary of the President's Advisory Committee on Environmental Quality back in 1965. 1975, 50 years ago, Margaret Mead, the American anthropologist, convened with Bill Kellogg and Steve Schneider a really interesting meeting on endangered atmospheres. 30 years ago, the first COP was held in Berlin. 25 years ago, in my own story, this month, just last week, we founded the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research at my old university in East Anglia. But actually, I'm wanting to start with this meeting 40 years ago, which happened in the middle week of October, so just over 40 weeks ago at Villach, this small town in Austria, you can see there. And this was a meeting held jointly between UNEP, WMO, and ICSU, the International Council for Scientific Unions, and it convened about 100 scientists from 29 different countries. It was at a time when the geopolitics of the world at that moment was on the cusp of a major transformation in the middle to late 1980s. And in terms of environmental politics, just earlier that year, the Vienna Convention had been held on protecting the ozone layer. And in fact, in May of that year, the ozone hole had been finally nailed by scientists in Cambridge. And of course, that led to the first treaty, the Montreal Protocol. And at the time that this meeting was held, the Brundtland Report was being drafted. It came out in 1987. So a lot was going on, and a lot of those factors shaped to a greater or lesser degree the way in which this conference went about thinking about climate change. In many senses, it actually established for the first time that climate change, human-caused climate change, was indeed a global problem. In fact, they very explicitly emphasized the globality of this problem, obviously from the perspective of the atmosphere, single atmosphere, but also in terms of politics. The 29 countries, I didn't do a count. In fact, Navros was just asking me. I suspect very, very few of those 100 scientists were from what would have then been called the Global South. Nearly all of those scientists, I would imagine, I've got a list somewhere, were North America, Europe, possibly 2 or 3 Russians and 2 or 3 Chinese. And it sought to establish an international consensus about the science of the changing climate and to explore a possible potential convention. So this was really important in framing the issue, and it led, as I said, to seeing this as a global phenomenon. Really important was the second point on the slide there, that the framework for thinking about how the pieces of the puzzle should be organized adopted what was called a DPS-IRR framework. Drivers, pressures, state of the system, impacts of the system, and then responses. This is a very natural science, engineering systems. You could almost think of a cybernetics approach to understanding the mechanics of what was going on. What the Villach conference did not do, which they could have done, was frame it in terms of geopolitical economy or in terms of the emerging issues around human development. Those were just not there. They were not represented in the scientists and in the discourse that was dominant at the time. Villach gave, interestingly, equal weight to both limiting the drivers, i.e. what we would now call mitigation, and to adapting to the impacts, what are the responses in this DPS-IRR framework. The risk, interestingly, was framed as much in terms of the rate of change. So global temperature and global sea level began to emerge as the preferable metrics to measure the extent of the problem. Nothing to do with the human world. Global temperature and global sea level were the metrics. It was rates of change that were deemed to be dangerous. And as scientists would always do, of course, argue for more research. But also, and this was important because it led through a sequence of later steps to the creation of the IPCC and then the Framework Convention on Climate Change, that governments should take account of the results of this meeting. There's a lot more to be said about this, and I should say that one of the reasons why Villach, this meeting in 1985, it's not just 40 years ago, it's in my mind, but I'm in the process of finishing up a book with a historian of science colleague thinking about the origins of global temperature. Where does this idea of global temperature come from, and that it somehow can represent or can stand in for a whole variety of things that concern us? And Villach was an important part of that scientific history. So there we go. This was the contingency planning framework. Global temperature, as I say, was foregrounded as the dominant way in which risk should be expressed. It had these three different scenarios: the surveillance, green, the action, yellow, the crisis, red. These were expressed in terms of, these were expressed at Villach in '85 as qualitative. No numbers at that point were put on these things, just recognizing that there was, as it were, a tolerable rate of change. There was an intermediate zone and there was a crisis zone. And this then led over the next 5 or 7 years to enshrining global temperature at the heart of the science and the politics of climate change. So from Villach, we went to this report in 1990 by Frank Riederbusman and Rob Schwartz for the Stockholm Environment Institute. This turned into the traffic light system here that Pierre Vellinger and Rob Schwartz wrote about in 1991. And this was then picked up by the IPCC in their burning embers diagrams, and all the way through using the color coding of danger through to current discourse, visual rhetorics around code red, climate emergencies, and so on. The origins of this we can trace right the way back then to this Villach meeting. And so in this period, say, 85 from Villach through to Framework Convention 92, the first COP in Berlin in 1995, this provided the basic building blocks for the way in which policy was going to engage with climate change. And as Dan Sarowitz has written about this, he referred to this as the plan, in inverted commas, the standard default plan of thinking about how climate change was going to be tackled under this framework. His three elements of the plan were: first, establish a scientific consensus, aggressively communicate that consensus to all who would listen to it or needed to listen to it, and that policy action would follow from that understanding. I'll just say a word or two about each of those three elements. Although I'm interested that this recent book from Martin Heyer and his colleague Jeroen Uman in the Netherlands called Captured Futures, Rethinking the Drama of Environmental Politics, interestingly, they very much pick up on that particular framing that Sarowitz recognized as this early framing. And as Martin Heyer in this book reports, this idea that natural science, with its value-neutral facts, can provide the necessary knowledge to create the solutions, and the policymakers in their pilot role would then define the targets. And if the targets go unmet, then those in the political cockpit escalate the urgency of language with ever stronger images of impending catastrophe, further diminishing citizens' feelings of political agency. This is, this has just come out in 2025, but this is classic ramifications of thinking about the problems of climate change through this threefold structure of Dan Sarowitz's plan. The consensus, and this then leads us into the IPCC, first report in 1990, John Horton in the preface in that first report, ensuring a high degree of consensus amongst the authors and the reviewers. And consensus right the way through the 30 or more years, 35 years of the IPCC, consensus has been central to the way in which the IPCC has operated in terms of its communication to its wider audiences. Aggressive communication, this follows what communication scholars talk about as a linear model of science communication, that knowledge flows from the scientist to the public, maybe through some intermediate stations along the way. And if that message isn't getting through to your public audience, then you either shout louder, or you simplify your language, or you get rid of these nasty people in the middle who are contaminating the message. And this sort of rhetoric we've seen recently about listening to scientists. If you're not a scientist, your job is simple. Well, listen to the scientists. That's all you need to do. And this then leads to the third part of the plan, which is that targets and timetables will follow. This was the assumption right away from the beginning. It was inherited very largely from the Montreal Protocol, which dealt with ozone, picked up by the UNFCCC, manifested in the Kyoto Protocol, attempted in 2009 at Copenhagen to ratchet those targets and timetables, and failed to do so in 2009 at Copenhagen. So that's the framing that emerged in this 1980s, 1990s period. The targets around this framing, and again, just rehearsing these, here were the rates, 0.1 to 0.3 per decade. This actually was Villach in 1987, not in 85. It was a meeting two years later that actually put some numbers on this. Rio talked about stabilizing concentrations and parts per million. The idea at the time was somewhere in the range 450 to 550. We then had COP3 with the Kyoto targets for Annex 1 countries, targets and timetables approaches. 2 degrees as an absolute number, now moving away from rates of change, 2 degrees now became the absolute, 2 degrees above pre-industrial. And this was first put into the Framework Convention documents agreed at Cancun in COP17, evolved into 1.5 to 2 at Paris, and then the derivative of 1.5 to 2, came out of Paris, and the way in which carbon budgets now began to be central, was this idea of net zero, that there needed to be at a particular future point a move towards net zero, globally, but also through national efforts. And so this is, in the last 10 years, now become the central framing. But it goes back to the use of global temperature. You don't get a net zero without knowing actually what your carbon budget is, and your carbon budget is determined by your temperature target. So global temperature has ended up becoming this organizing principle. And so, this is part of one of the key points I'm wanting to say here, that this is focusing on the state of the Earth system, 1.5 or 2 degrees. These numbers have become ever more precisely quantified to tenths of a degree or to hundredths of a degree, and therefore to millions of tons of carbon. They become rhetorically inflexible. Success or failure around this whole climate change problem is now determined by whether these numbers are hit or met by a particular date. And one could argue, and I will come back to this thing about the glass being half full or half empty, but one could argue that these have all failed, or the perception is that all of these targets have all failed. And at this point, I just want to make a slight further detour, historical detour. So I want to go back 80 years now, just to the end of the Second World War. And this book by Hans Morgenthau, German emigrant to the United States and political theorist, and his book, Scientific Man versus Power Politics. 2 moods, he said, determine the attitude of our civilization. Confidence in the power of reason, as represented by science, to solve the social problems of our age, and despair at the ever-renewed failure of scientific reason to solve them. Confidence in the power of reason and despair at the inability of reason to solve our problems. And I think this gestures towards something really important here about the way in which climate change has been framed right the way back to this DS-IPR framework and this idea of this whole problem being an engineering puzzle that needs to be solved. This idea that we can control this Earth system and the human interaction with it in a way that can generate particular targets by particular dates. Much more recently, here are 2 environmental thinkers, both from Arizona State University, Sander van der Loo and Gary Dirks, saying actually something very, very similar. Why, in relation to climate change, with all the detailed information and the environment, is it proving so very difficult to actually respond adequately to this? And I think it's worth just stopping to think about this paradox, this sense on the one hand that we have got all these tools around science, we've got the power of reason, and yet actually this doesn't seem to be able to deliver in relation to climate change and targets and timetables what it is that we seek to secure. And for a talk I gave earlier this year as part of the Hayek program at LSE, I went back and read some of Friedrich Hayek's original work. I'm not wanting to claim that I'm an expert on Hayek, but I did find it interesting, one strand of his thinking as an economist and about thinking about economic policy, which seemed to me to resonate really importantly with this paradox that we have around climate change, which is this idea of there is no central brain. There is no adequate comprehensive understanding, in his sense, of the economy. All we have are dispersed bits of incomplete and frequently contradictory knowledge, which different individuals will possess. For him, this led, of course, into a particular way of thinking about economic policy and market-based mechanisms. But if we apply this thinking to the Earth system or to the problems of climate change and the knowledge that we think we're generating, if only we could actually create this knowledge with a sufficient degree of consensus or put the building blocks together in such a way, or to be able to identify the levers that we can push and pull, we can actually deliver this world of 1.5 or 2 degrees or net zero by a particular date. I think it's a cautionary tale that suggests that maybe that type of thinking is always doomed to fail. And so I've written about this. Now, the state nor UN-centric manifestations of power, nor the workings of the market, nor the surprises wrought by cultural, economic, and technical systems. I've added this additional line as well, nor techno-fixes in the skies. I'm going to come on to talking about solar radiation management in a minute. But none of these things will ever allow future climate a predictable, safe landing. Or Inga Anderson here, as the UNEP Chief Executive Director, commenting a week or two ago, 3 attempts, and each time these attempts have landed off target. There's something right at the heart of the way in which we're thinking here about climate change that is setting us up to fail. The system cannot be controlled with this type of engineering precision or determinism that we might want it to be. And I think part of this goes back right the way back to this thinking of the problem in terms of a systems approach, Earth systems approach, and manifested as global temperature as being the, as it were, the control function, the dial that we're actually trying to control. So, with this digression, nevertheless, the plan, Sarah's plan, was doubled down in the period after Paris. So in that moment after Paris 2017, 1890, before COVID, before the Soviet invasion of Ukraine, this was the last throw of the dice. There was scarier science put into play. Tipping cascades in the Earth system began to be talked about. Risk amplification, youth mobilization, which led to a huge explosion of anxiety amongst teenagers and young people who were sold the lie that they've got no future. In fact, just this morning I read in the UK, there's a new report from our government, our UK Health Security Committee, pointing out the sheer numbers of people, particularly young people now, suffering from eco-anxiety, and the dangers that this is going to lead to an epidemic of drug addictions, of young people moving on to antidepressants. And emergency declarations that followed from all of this, 1.5 to stay alive. Emergency declarations, again, is something I've written about, as something that's very dangerous. Once you declare an emergency, it's very difficult to get out of an emergency. And here is Aldous Huxley writing back in 1958 about the dangers that a permanent crisis justifies permanent control of everybody and everything by the agencies of central government. Emergencies are things that we should be very wary of entering into, I would suggest, at least in free, open democracies. So this was the doubling down on the plan. However, since then, the world has changed, or at least the pace of change in the world has accelerated. COVID was about to arrive. War resurrected itself on the European continent. Austerity followed. Populist politics began to find places of entrenchment in areas that we may never have expected to find it. New nationalisms now seemingly are gaining ever greater political and popular attention and attraction. The tailwinds, if you like to put it this way, the tailwinds of this way of thinking about climate change in the 1980s and the 1990s, collapse of communism, the New World Order, new set of optimistic globalisms, globalization that emerged at the end of the 20th century, those have been replaced now with headwinds in our current moment. And so we find then that these targets, even if they may have believed to have been deliverable, are of course now being rowed back from. And I think if we think about this, then we begin to understand, some of the problems with targets. And I often compare and contrast global temperature as a target around which policy is designed with GDP. And as we know, with GDP is a very limited way of capturing everything that matters to a particular society and economy. Measures output, ignores quality, costs, or purposes. Global temperature, again, is a very limited way of thinking about the problems associated with a changing climate. It measures the system state in its entirety, but it doesn't tell us anything at all about the distributional dynamics, the different measures of welfare, whether human welfare or ecological welfare, that actually matter to most people. It has become, and I take this metaphor from that Nature editorial, where it referred to GDP as an emperor metric. And it seems to me that global temperature has again become an emperor metric, a metric that has sovereign power over the world that is concerned with a changing climate. And here in this book, Jerry Muller, Tyranny of Metrics, makes various astute observations, but one of which is that metrics such as GDP, such as global temperature, they may make a troubling situation more salient, but they actually don't make the underlying problems more soluble. And this whole idea of global temperature as an emperor metric is, again, as I say, something that I'm exploring in this new book that we're just finishing off, about how global temperature managed to find itself at the locus of this whole problem that we call global climate change. Here's the emperor metric then of global temperature. And here I come to Bill Gates, that open letter I mentioned before just a couple of weeks ago, suggesting that temperature is not the best way to measure progress on climate. It doesn't capture many of the things that actually are most important, more generally in the world, but even the things that are most important to us if we're thinking through the lens of a changing climate. And again, as I've written in my more recent book, this was the one that Navros mentioned at the beginning, Climate Change Isn't Everything. As I put there, actually global temperature, I can certainly imagine worlds with a global temperature of 2.3 degrees of warming that on a whole set of criteria are much more desirable to deliver than a world with 1.7 degrees of warming. Global temperature by itself actually is a very poor indicator of the things that we're trying to protect or to secure. And here I just give a couple of examples of how this, what I think this emperor metric of global temperature can mislead us. We can head off down wrong tracks, I think. So this came out of the Earth System, the Earth Commissioners, this body of global intellectuals organized under the Program of Future Earth. This was published in 2004. And what they did is they wanted to put forward an argument that a world in which was only 1 degree warmer than the pre-industrial, well, that's a world that's already passed. But a world of 1 degree of warming is more just than a world of 1.5. Now, you know, they reach that conclusion through various forms of deliberation and analysis. What interested me is the way in which they foregrounded global temperature as a way of defining a just world. I don't think that is a very appropriate way of actually defining what justice is. It leads to thermostat thinking. This is the other issue. This is where we come into solar geoengineering and the dangers for an engineering mind to think, well, if the control function is global temperature, as environmental engineers, we can easily manipulate that. And so, again, just a couple of weeks ago, we saw this announcement from Stardust, this startup company, attracting $60 million of private venture capital to actually start experimentation in the skies with forms of particulate injection. This is a profit startup and has caused a certain amount of concern, let's put it that way, about this form of solutionism. And then deadlineism. This is something, again, I mentioned, you know, this idea that we're running out of time. Time scarcity, it induces, it has psychological misbenefits and costs. It actually also, I think, the danger here of thinking about very short deadlines and time scarcity, it can actually lead to poorly thought out policy initiatives. If at all costs we have to achieve these particular numbers by a particular date, then we haven't got time in order to think about some of the secondary or tertiary consequences of these policies, or indeed to go through processes of democratic deliberation or accountability. So these are some of the dangers, it seems to me, of paying our dues to the emperor metric of global temperature. So, yeah, I mean, a unified narrative. What I'm wanting to say here is that here we come back to some of the thinking that inspired my book about why we disagree about climate change. I know there are those captured on this slide here who have called for a particular move to a single narrative around the world about what global temperature is. I think that's it offers an entirely false premise, because actually when we think about what the problem of climate change is, we actually see that there are a lot of different things going on amongst political actors around the world, in different national cultures, in different political formations. This is actually something I'll talk a little bit more tomorrow morning in the seminar that I'm giving at breakfast. But I've just pulled out here are the 7 different things here. Is this a problem of too much CO2 in the atmosphere? The CO2 problem. Is this a technical matter? So whether it's through pricing, whether it's through technology, whether it's through geoengineering, actually this is just a technical problem that we can find levers that we can push and pull that will solve the problem. This other framing that manifests itself in different ways, this idea of security. Actually, this is a problem of energy security, personal security, human security, in terms of thinking about people who are vulnerable to changing weather extremes, or more recently thinking about national security. So recently the Council for Foreign Affairs here in the States has come up with this idea called the Climate Realism Initiative, which some of you probably know more about than I do. But it's a very interesting way of reframing the problems of climate change around a very nation-first agenda. Is this a justice problem? So, for example, is this actually around the development deficit, as we might think of that in countries such as India? Is this an everything problem? This is certainly what animated quite a lot of the youth movements 7 or 8 years ago. It's system change we demand, not just stopping climate change. And this leads to the existential problem that came out of the darker movements of Extinction Rebellion and other doomist commentators. Or indeed, a different narrative, this is actually a problem of human nature. This is Pope Francis' encyclical from 2015, Laudato Si. The heart of the issues around climate change, they're not technical, they're not security, they're not even justice. They're actually something that comes down to the very central elements of our own individual behaviors and moral behaviors. So my point is, and this is in essence what I was arguing for and why we disagree about climate change is not one problem. It is many problems all wrapped up together. And this idea that solving climate change by hitting a particular number by a particular date seems to me a very inadequate, or maybe at best, it's a very minimalist way of thinking about what really matters to the vast majority of people. And so as I come to conclude, let me come round to this, what actually has been achieved. Is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? And I, in thinking about this and listening to a lot of the voices swirling around in the run-up to COP30 over the last 3 or 4 weeks, it seems as though people aren't quite sure. And actually, I'm not even quite sure myself. And I'd be interested in hearing some of your thoughts on this. Are things really as bad as some people make out? Or actually, has the world actually achieved, by one means or another, quite a significant change in, if we can call it this, the trajectory of human development on the planet? And again, a 40-year perspective is quite interesting here. Of course, it depends what we're using as our metrics. If we move away from simply global temperature, and this is why different people commenting on climate change are actually seeing the problem through a different lens. If the problem really is about system change, getting rid of the white, patriarchal, racist, capitalist system, then maybe progress hasn't been great. But other people will actually measure success using different metrics. So, we can look in terms of just carbon emissions, and pretty much all of those high-end scenarios that were there in the IPCC stress in 2000, those are the ones that I was helping to put together when I was involved with the IPCC 25 years ago, or the RCPs more recently. Most of those high-end scenarios, just in terms of carbon emissions, are now out of the ballpark. If we could look at global weather losses, damage caused as a percentage of global GDP by extreme weather, it's flatlined or even slightly declined when normalized, benchmarked against rates of inflation. We can look at child mortality, the bottom right here. If actually this is what is animating most of our concern, we've seen huge increases in reductions in global mortality. Or the chart at the bottom here, these are deaths related to extreme weather over the last 150 years. A massive decrease in the fatality caused by extreme weather. I remember these headlines. I was running the Tyndall Centre at the time, 2007, 2008. The final warning, this was on the front page of one of our big nationals in 2007, around the time of the fourth assessment report. It started off at 2.4 and went right the way up to 6.4. This is the final warning. Actually, we're probably somewhere now heading for somewhere between about 2.3 and 2.7 on current policies, if they're executed. So 2.4, rather than being the starting point, we actually may find it's the ending point. Or Bob Watson, who we worked with for a little while at the Tyndall Centre, I remember this. Prepare for a global temperature of 4 degrees, warns top scientist. 4-degree scenarios are now right at the very, very fringe of what is plausible. And we can argue whether this is because of the various policies or the framings, and maybe I'm contradicting myself, but I think my point is that depending on how we look at this, a significant amount actually has been achieved. Cost of clean energy is falling. Coal is being squeezed out. High-end scenarios. Climate adaptation now very clearly embedded in many, many institutional plans and organizations and national strategies. Short-term weather forecasts. This is one of the really important ways in which those graphs have been reduced, whether it's human loss of life, whether it's protecting capital. The improvements in weather forecasting over the last 40 years has been quite phenomenal. An acceleration in innovation, whether it's new energy technologies, whether it's in new materials that are much more energy efficient or actually able to enhance the sustainability of buildings. These are things that 20 years ago, certainly 40 years ago, would have been seen as really good news to many of those scientists meeting in Villach and to some of those early environmental commentators, I would suggest. And then if we think about what more can be achieved, and of course there's always more to be achieved. But here, and this is why I would argue, where some of these numbers and metrics it can be misleading or can be a straitjacket, we need to be rather more pragmatic, I think, in terms of actually what can be done, how quickly it needs to be done. Climate pragmatism, politics, the art of the possible. And these are policies, and this was what we argued for in the Hartwell paper in 2010, 2011. And what I think in some sense Bill Gates is getting at in his open letter, these are things that can be justified not because they're going to deliver a particular temperature number or deliver a particular net zero by a certain date, but these are policies that actually have got justifications on multiple criteria. You don't have to play the climate card in order to find incentives in order to push certain policy buttons. So whether it's climate resilience, about cleaner air, it's around enhanced agricultural productivity or higher nutrition status for agriculture, whether it's thinking about nature-based solutions, restoring or enhancing ecosystem health, or the umbrella basket of SDGs. These are the criteria, these are the incentives, these are the motives that actually I think are more powerful and appeal in a more hopeful spirit to populations around the world or political actors in particular situations. So glass half full, glass half empty. I don't know. Was there another path not taken at Villach? We're living with a legacy of that framing. I still think, even though the world has changed since the 1980s and 1990s, was there another path not taken? Maybe not. Maybe, whether there was path dependency actually created at that moment in the mid-1980s, I'm not sure. We could debate that. Was there another way we could have taken this forward? I think when I think about experimenting, I think about these 3 dimensions. The geophysical experiment, of course, this is the famous inadvertent geophysical experiment with the planet. That's the way Earth systems people think about experimentation. Actually, the whole idea of beginning to try to govern the climate through transnational institutions and negotiations was a speculative experiment in transnational government. Successful? Not successful? maybe a bit of both. I think the geoengineering experiment, the solar geoengineering experiment, I think personally I find that a very dangerous experiment to embark upon, the idea of advertent. It's an advertent geophysical experiment. We actually don't know the full consequences of injecting huge volumes of particles up into the stratosphere. And I think my overall thinking about this actually is that the human story is always experimental. The future in that sense is always open. Foresight and control is always an illusion. Do we know, did people know back in 1990 what the internet would do? Or gene editing or AI? Have we actually got any idea at all about what these things will do in 25? I mean, think ahead 40 years. Villach was 40 years ago. Think ahead 40 years, 65. Think about the rate at which AI is already transforming pretty much all areas of human public life. Do we have any idea about what that's going to do to our world? Or gene editing, how that's going to change our bodies? So I think a certain degree of humility then also is valuable to have in settings like this, in particular around climate change. And I just leave with this quote. I like this, C.S. Lewis, one of my go-to authors for a bit of moral and spiritual inspiration. But this is a comment by Stanley Harowitz, an American Catholic, working at more limited objectives. We work quietly away at limited objectives. Real progress is made by those who, with discrete aims, such as the abolition of the slave trade, prison reform or factory acts, or cure for tuberculosis, not for those who think they can achieve universal justice, health, or peace, or think that they can land the climate system at a particular number at a particular date. That, to me, is an objective that's beyond the reach of any human ability to do. We can work away, though, at more limited objectives, where we can see successes, we can see steps being made that actually bring about certain goods and eliminate certain bads, at least in certain jurisdictions and for certain people groups. Thank you for listening, and I'll be interested in any thoughts and views you have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ms. Hulme. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and it's not a great amount of time, but I am nonetheless going to abuse my privilege and put two very quick questions to you to kick us off, myself, if that's okay. The first, I think, is kind of works with the grain of your talk a little bit, and that is to say you didn't mention one of the instances of this sort of numerical, if you like, fetishization, which is the recent International Court of Justice opinion that kind of reinforces the 1.5 temperature threshold. Curious for your reflection on that. But then the other part of it is to maybe push back against a little bit of the thrust of your conversation and ask, even if temperature is reductionist, even if that causal chain is suspect, from consensus to action, is it not the case, perhaps, especially that we have to think about calling out those messages lands differently depending on the particular moment at which it lands? And are we now at a moment where calling that out also becomes an excuse to call out or to question underlying climate science and the fact that there are biophysical impacts of rising temperatures, even if we can't calibrate it quite as carefully as some of these folks have tried to do?
Okay, so just two quick things then. On the legal adjudication, so in a sense, if I've understood, what are the role of the courts? The role of the courts are not to reinvent science or to change evidence. It is to actually interpret what actually is the legal obligation of certain actors under an existing set of regimes. And in that sense, if you take the Paris Agreement, if 1.5 to 2 degrees is the politically agreed objective, then the International Court, in a sense, can't move away from that. All it can do is to say, well, whether is this particular action or this particular inaction consistent with that or not. The one thing about numbers and whether it undermines science, I don't see that it necessarily does. And I think, in a sense, we're not going to unwrite, we're not going to unwrite the Paris Agreement. We're not going to suddenly stop talking about numbers and net zero. I think all I can be arguing for is to use it to sort of use the metaphor, is to just to cool down the language around this, the rhetoric around this. That these are, I don't see these as absolute thresholds that exist in some physical state within the Earth system. You know, a lot of talk about tipping points. Actually, we don't really know where tipping points exist in numerical terms. So I just think that I think you used the word there, fetish. The fetishizing of these numbers is the problem. Not necessarily that the numbers exist, or at least if the numbers exist, let's multiply the numbers. Let's have actually a number of other targets that we can put in play against which we can measure success. You know, for example, about some of the indicators in the human world, you know, around some of the SDGs, which I think in a sense is all that Bill Gates is calling for, is that we don't lose sight of actually why we're concerned about climate change in the first place. We're not concerned about climate change because of a number. This is what the solar engineers, to me, seem to get wrong. We're concerned about climate change in the first place because it actually impacts negatively on individual or collective human or ecological communities.
Thank you. Okay, floor is open for questions. Maybe let's collect 3 or so questions. You start at the back and then move up to where?
Maybe this is, and thank you, it's a really interesting talk, but maybe this is back to the previous question, but also the inverse of that, which is you had the slide where you had the scientists through the journalists, through policymakers, through the public. And clearly one of the issues with giving these numbers is it's a number for somebody to look at, but it doesn't mean anything necessarily to the public. You say 2 degrees global temperature, it doesn't translate to someone's experience, doesn't translate to a policy framework. So, or not maybe a framework, but what policy makers can communicate to the public. So for a scientist who wants to report a number, maybe it's easy, but is there a way maybe that you think we can reverse that graph and change how the scientists are talking so that we're not in that sort of UN focus, listen to the experts do that, every nation is in its own geopolitical situation, we have to speak to the times rather than...
Do you want to take a couple? Yes, let's take way as well.
Yeah, my question is actually very relevant. I agree these targets are not that helpful, but they're also simpler messages and concepts to convey. And I think one of the criticisms for SDG, for example, is that they're too complicated. It combine too many things. Can you comment on that? If they're not using temperature target as the message in the international arena, what do you see as the alternative so that we can still keep it compelling and communicable?
One more here, and then you'll go back.
I'm wondering if the problem is the tyranny of metrics, as Mueller and you put it, or if it's the tyranny of a particular kind of atmospheric science metric. The most successful intervention in climate change, arguably, is a country that is absolutely obsessed with metrics, which is China. The entire governance from every scale of society of its economy is achieved through an obsession with metrics. So, but that's about industrial development and economic development. That's not about climate change. So is the problem metrics or is the problem atmospheric science metrics?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so cluster of thinking about this then. So you know, we can either go down the metrics route, like China, or I think what you're arguing for is have more human-centered stories or narratives or experiential. And of course, this has been a parallel rising phenomenon within scholarship and advocacy around climate change, is exactly that, to move away from the numbers and center people's stories, whether from those who are most marginal, those who are most exposed, those actually who have achieved particular changes on a very small scale in their own local communities to demonstrate what can be secured. So, you know, sort of bottom-up grassroots type of narratives. And those, in many senses, those become much more engaging or appealing for audiences to listen to, rather than just another IPCC report with another set of numbers simply showing how far we're going wrong with the numbers. So I think there absolutely is, in terms of communication strategy, to think of those more human-based stories. so the contrast of that then is, okay, the China obsession with metrics. And I think global temperature, I mean, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to imagine now for us here in 2025 how the story of climate change could be told without global temperature. I mean, imagine that somehow global temperature didn't exist. Scientists had never come up with that number. How would we be telling the story of climate change? Or how would we be measuring success? Which is the thing about, well, what other metrics might we use if we're going to move away from these Earth system metrics? I mean, I think, one, I mean, it is related, but I think it in a sense, it's closer to the action than global temperature, which is very distant and abstract, is thinking about rates of decarbonization. And think of it as a rate of decarbonization, or a threshold. You get away from this threshold thinking, which again has got all sorts of psychological problems. And of course, if we look at rates of decarbonization, certainly if you normalize it by GDP or per capita, then actually there's a success story to be told in many countries, even here in America. Now, you want to bend that curve further. I mean, all the curves are going down pretty much now, and you want to bend that curve further. But that sets up the possibility for a more positive narrative, and it gets away from threshold thinking, and it actually targets something actually that you could argue for multiple criteria as well. It's not just we're going to save the climate, we're actually going to improve air quality, and we're going to diversify our dependency upon one particular energy system. So I think there are other metrics, but I think it's very difficult, this idea of path dependency, it's very difficult for us to get out of the framing that we've inherited. So at Berlin this week, and the numbers keep coming out every week or so. You mentioned about, carbon tracker and climate tracker and so on. The numbers are always going to be there. And we're going to be measuring success or failure to the nearest, million tons or to the 100th degree or whatever, which I just don't find very satisfactory, I suppose.
Just to add, we have a question for today's, but I guess that also extends to doing that same kind of quantification for individual countries, which is the further level.
Yeah.
Denise?
I don't know if it's a question or follow on from your statement and the conversation that you just preceded that, because I completely agree that these thresholds can be distracting. They're easy to understand, but they can distract from the crucial thing, which is reducing the emissions of the greenhouse gas. And so this idea of net zero or decarbonization, I think, is more relevant now. I would say that actually the absolute is also important, that the rate may be not sufficient, that we really do want to have a target, and it needs to be expanded beyond just carbon to include other greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide, which is really tied to agriculture. And that we can tell a good story, that is moving quickly right now, and that some of these metrics that are being used to show that are really valuable. But this temperature remains important because it does show that things may become really difficult for not only humans but other species on Earth if things continue to change to a 3-degree target, a 3-degree temperature increase.
Before my response, any final questions? Because otherwise we'll shut down after that with streets. Okay, fine.
Okay, I mean, this is a conversation to have. I mean, net zero, in a sense, collapses those things together, though. If what you're arguing for is let's look at what's happening with CO2, with nitrous oxide, with methane, with smoke particulates. Let's look at those as individual categories and to see actually what are the stretch targets that for each of those can be delivered. Net zero sort of collapses those. And at the same time, of course, what net zero does, it opens up another whole discourse, which is about carbon offsets, which actually can sometimes be a distraction from what really is the objective here, which is to extract fossil fuels out of our energy system entirely. And it also, the whole net zero climate change, global temperature thing, gets confounded by this whole question about aerosols as well. and this is why just global temperature as a metric on itself is in danger of being seriously misleading, because it just doesn't differentiate between all the different various forcing factors.
And there's a time lag with it also. So you could reach net zero, but the temperature could continue to increase because of the thermal momentum.
Yeah. So I think plurality of targets is at least one thing that we could argue for, that you have a basket of targets. You don't collapse everything into a single net zero, and you measure your success, your failure, and you become obsessed about the timelines of this aggregate metric that really, and this is what Jerry Muller says in his book about the tyranny of metrics. As soon as you create a metric, it can be gamed. And there's a certain amount of gaming that is going on about net zero global temperature, certainly about net zero.
Great. Well, thank you very much for making us sort of provoking and making us think in this larger question of how you frame climate change, which I think we've been one of the most sort of thoughtful interlocutors on over the years. So I've learned a lot from your work. Thank you very much for visiting us, and thank you for sharing your review.
Thank you.